Due Process, winner of 19 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights, and the 2011 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Outstanding Discussion Series. Due Process is a presentation of Rutgers School of Law, Newark, and the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy. Studio facilities provided by the Rutgers ITV Studio, Division of Continuing Studies.
When thinking about patients who both drink and smoke marijuana, I am generally much more concerned about their alcohol use than their marijuana use.
One doctor's opinion on the relative dangers of smoking pot, and one rationale for new pending legislation. Legalize marijuana for recreational use? That controversial question of decriminalization, up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.
The fight for medical marijuana, pot, to alleviate pain and suffering, that took 2 decades, and nearly 2 years after passage, it's still not up and running. So what are the chances for a new bill that's being floated to decriminalize smoking weed just for pleasure? It's proposed legislation sure to light up the State House and this edition of Due Process. I'm Raymond Brown.
And I'm Sandra King. New polls say there's now overwhelming support for marijuana as medicine. And a slim majority seem even to favor greater tolerance for smoking to get high. But could that be enough to move lawmakers, scared of seeming soft on drugs, and of indelible images like these?
May!
What do you want?
Bring me some reefers.
There was a movie in the 1930s that's very well known to people who know about marijuana.
Plate buster.
It was called Reefer Madness. It showed how the consumption of marijuana can lead to violence.
But psychiatrist David Nathan says that 1930s celluloid image was simply scare tactic.
He is hopelessly and incurably insane, a condition caused by the drug marijuana to which he was addicted.
One that clearly didn't work, as evidenced by another film 30-plus years later.
Coming into Los Angeles.
Because by Woodstock and the late 60s, marijuana was ubiquitous, at least among the young.
Marijuana!
It was a way of life when I first started. I was about 17 in college, and it was the socially acceptable thing to do. Drinking was not.
And for that generation, the stigma once attached to pot had virtually disappeared.
Don't criticize it.
So who would have thought that more than 40 years later, you could still go to jail for smoking a joint?
New Jersey had about 26,000 marijuana arrests last year. That constitutes about 52% of all drug arrests in the state. And 85% of the marijuana charges are less than 50 grams.
A reflection not just of aggressive police work, but of just how present pot smoking still is.
Like, this is crazy.
And not just among the young. Many of those baby boomers for whom weed was the drug of choice in their youth are smoking still.
Can I get you something? Milk? Soda? A joint?
And not just on the tube.
Well, it's very much a part of my life and has been since I graduated college. I use it to relax. I find it much more satisfying than drinking and safer.
And that's one of the arguments for making it legal.
I regard alcohol as being a much more dangerous drug than marijuana ever could be.
For a new legislative effort to decriminalize small amounts of pot, not this time for easing illness, but for recreational use.
Oftentimes you see this appearing in colleges and other social gatherings, and to leave that offender with a criminal record, I think does not fit the crime in this regard.
We do have laws on the books that are very hard, very tough. We need to enforce them. You gotta have the will to enforce the law.
And that was part of his platform in a recent unsuccessful run for county office. A retired Nutley police lieutenant, Steve Rogers is appalled by Gusiora's latest legislative effort.
The political establishment ought to think about talking to some of the parents whose children will be affected by a law like this, not positively but adversely. I just wonder what the moms and dads would say about a law like this.
Well, that depends on which parents you ask. So if your kids come to you and say, okay, I want to get high on something, should I have a drink or should I smoke a joint?
I would say do your homework. I mean, honestly, I think the legal trouble with pot tips the balance.
And if there were no legal consequences?
I would definitely say pot rather than alcohol.
But Tom Moran isn't just a parent. He's also the editorial voice of New Jersey's statewide paper. And it's under his leadership that the Star-Ledger's taken a surprisingly strong stand for decriminalization.
If you look at the opinion polls, the Star-Ledger, I think, is probably changing with everybody else. What is it, 50% nationwide, the latest Gallup said, want to fully legalize pot.
I haven't done it in like 40 years, whatever the case may be, 50 years. But a little pot's not bad. It just gives you a little buzz.
It's such a small amount. It could ruin your life if you do get caught.
Does it bother you that it's illegal?
Well, I could say very much so. One of the organizations I support is NORML. I think it's long overdue for decriminalization. I can tell you, as somebody who's beat cancer twice, I don't know what I would have done without my joints.
But it's not smokers like these who risk arrest. A disproportionate number of pot busts involve young blacks and Latinos. And once there's been an arrest, whites are far less likely to serve time.
While studies clearly show that white adolescents and young adults are much more likely to smoke marijuana than African American youth, it is actually African American youth who are much more likely to be arrested and convicted of marijuana consumption.
I'm freaking out. What is this?
But what of the argument that marijuana leads to more serious drugs?
My 38 years experience on a police department shows me that the legalization of marijuana is a gateway to greater problems for our society.
Yes, people who use hard drugs often also use marijuana, but they also use alcohol. So it doesn't really establish any kind of cause and effect.
Alcohol is not a gateway drug to anything, all right? Marijuana is a gateway drug to cocaine, to crack, to other drugs that give you a greater high.
You haven't been tempted to use heroin?
Absolutely not.
No, and most of the people that we grew up with just were pot smokers. Maybe they smoked hash if it was there, but they weren't injecting, they weren't snorting heroin and they weren't shooting up. It wasn't that kind of thing.
No, we were into peace and love.
I gotta get my friend. I gotta get my friend to love. Don't you know I'm standing for your life? I gotta get my friends together.
Well, even if you reject the weed worship of Woodstock or the wild warnings of Reefer Madness, chances are you have some strong feelings on the subject, not unlike our guests here in the studio.
Rutgers Philosophy Professor Doug Husak has lectured and written extensively on decriminalization of marijuana. He may find some common ground with Dr. William Howard, pastor of Newark's Bethany Baptist Church and former chair of the Rutgers University Board of Governors. But they're likely to get some strong pushback from Donald Rinaldi, who handled countless drug cases in his years as an assistant Essex County prosecutor. Welcome to all of you. Doug, let me start with you and see if we can sort of set the scene in terms of the discussion. This is proposed legislation that really nibbles at the margins of marijuana use and possession. It would decriminalize effectively up to 15 grams, although you'd still face some sanctions, but it wouldn't be a disorderly persons offense. It doesn't touch overall marijuana use. It doesn't touch other controlled substances, and it doesn't drive at the core question of whether the criminal justice system is the right tool to use for controlling the use of marijuana or other controlled substances. Yet it seems in the legislature that there's going to be a Donnybrook. It's got 20 sponsors, but it has some adamant opposition, and it's likely to be controversial. Why would a bill that really doesn't go to the core questions that you've written and talked about, criminal justice and drug use, cause such controversy?
People are worried about where it might lead, and so there is controversy about this bill, but I think people are worried that if we go this first step, what will come next? And so the forces that are against the end of the road are very worried about this very first step, I think.
Let me just follow up on that critical question that I think you raise often, which is there is at bottom a question about whether, even if we want to control the use of drugs, let's talk about adults. That there's a question that ought to be asked by society about whether the criminal justice system is the way to go. Is that likely to be debated in a direct way in discussing this kind of bill?
Well, the political realities here are not things that philosophers are the best people to comment on.
So we shouldn't listen to philosophers in our...
Well, in terms of what kind of discussion we'll have. I mean, I'm not sure that... I mean, the public probably has made up its mind pretty much on this. And so politicians have to decide whether it's in their political interest to take one position or another. So I don't think that the kinds of inputs that philosophers have about this topic are likely to really play a very big role in the debate.
Don, given what Raymond has just outlined, what this bill would be, what it would do, what it wouldn't touch, why would you oppose it? It seems relatively, if not harmless, irrelevant.
Well, number one, I don't think there's any question that marijuana is, as Steve Rogers said, a gateway drug. It's been my experience that you start with marijuana. It's probably the safest drug that you could take. And from marijuana, you graduate to other drugs.
But don't you also drink alcohol before you do other drugs?
But the difference is, and there's a big difference between marijuana and alcohol. I can have a drink with dinner, I can have a glass of wine with dinner and drive home. I can't smoke a joint and drive home. That's the difference. There's no purpose to the marijuana except to get high. Lots of people enjoy fine wine and they have one or two drinks and it doesn't affect them and they can drive and they can function.
Well, unfortunately, alcohol use in this country is not limited to a glass of fine wine. In fact, most people are drinking something other. And they're doing it to get high.
Well, some people do it to get high, but you don't have to do it to get high. Marijuana, the only purpose of marijuana is to get high. There's no other reason.
All right, I want to come back to the gateway concept in a minute, but I want to go back to Doug, and I want to involve you, Bill, in Doug's question, which is this. If there is this core question, and generally I don't like philosophers involved in real life, but in this case I think we ought to have a full discussion. But if there is this core question, you just masterfully led the initiative to get rid of the death penalty, and you did it, in my view, by avoiding the core question about the death penalty and retribution, which lies at the heart of it, and talking about other important policy questions like cost, like the difficulty in enforcing the legislation on the books, as opposed to talking about the core questions. So in this context, should we talk about the question of whether we have a system that makes sense from a pharmacological point of view, that we have cocaine classified as an opiate, that we've never had a real discussion about the harm of each drug and whether the criminal justice system should be used? Should we do that, or just, if you want to make progress, be happy that there's a little bill that's making a little change that might lead to bigger change?
I'm sitting here wondering who really wants to smoke a joint, avoid smoking a joint because the law prohibits it. I think we've got to face the fact that the so-called war on drugs is a failure. It's an absolute failure. We hosted at our church in March of last year, or was it this year?
This year.
A conference on the war on drugs. And expert after expert helped us to understand that we are spending a lot more money to achieve almost no measurable result over time. And what it is doing in my community is criminalizing a generation. And it's an economic question in many instances. You heard the person say, these are not the users in the main, but it's a way to earn a little money.
Which brings me, Bill, to the essential question, which is, other than get some suburban kids off the hook when they've been caught behind the 7-Eleven smoking a joint, what would this bill do? It seems to me that in our community, in Newark, you would not have any effect on the kids who are being busted for selling a dime bag, not smoking a joint, and who wind up in the system not just for that first term, but then it becomes a cycle that repeats and repeats and repeats.
Well, I can tell you I meet young men, late teens, early 20s, who have virtually no prospect of legal work in their lives because so many potential employers, because they have a run-in with the law, won't go near them. Not so much because of why they were arrested, but that because they were arrested.
So do you look at this legislation and say, this isn't going to help my community?
I'm not that familiar with the legislation.
It's only personal use, very small amount.
Yeah, well, I think
doesn't affect sales at all.
I'm at rock bottom an advocate of controlling these substances, taxing them, and using the resources for treatment. Because I think, Ray, your question about law enforcement is really at the core. I'm going to tell you, people who want to use pot today are going to find the pot. So we need to find a way to be sure that the pot is not laced with really, really harmful substances, place it in places where people can purchase it under some kind of regulation, and use the money to help the folk who want help. Arresting people and stigmatizing them for the rest of their lives is losing left and right. I see this over and over again.
Doug, let me ask you and then Don to comment on another aspect of this, which is there's a profound race effect in terms of talking about this. I mean, on this bill, I think there are black legislators on both sides, but we know that roughly speaking, blacks use about 12% of the drugs and do about 20 to 40% of the time, depending on, in prison, depending on where we are, what jurisdiction, what the drug is. And that affects the debate. Because where there's a race effect, there's obviously going to be a more complicated discussion. Is there a way to deal with this in a way that shows some real awareness of and sensitivity to that effect?
Well, Bill says it's an economic issue, and of course it is. And it's an issue on so many levels. But I think the core question is one of justice. And so we have to decide whether it's just to use the criminal law to punish people who use pot, be they black or white. And so if that's the core question that needs to be addressed, then that's what we should be talking about. And there's very little debate, I think, on that level. People like to talk about dollars and cents, and that's important, of course. But the fundamental question is why anyone would think that it's just to punish someone for using marijuana.
In your days as a prosecutor, did you ever have occasion, not to question about whether people should use marijuana, but to question whether the tool you had was the right tool, the use of criminal justice in connection with modest use of marijuana?
Well, first of all, people that use marijuana, for example, in their home, they're not going to get arrested. Whether you're black or white, if you're in your house and you're smoking a joint, you're not going to get arrested. Under our law now, I could be in my bedroom smoking a joint, and if I get caught, I lose my license for 6 months. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, one doesn't have anything to do with the other. If you're in a car with marijuana, it's different. So the law just doesn't make any sense as a whole.
So you would liberalize the laws on marijuana?
No, because it opens up a whole Pandora's box. If you're going to make possession of a small amount of marijuana legal, who's going to sell it? Well, the same people that sell drugs now are going to sell the marijuana. And they're going to be making the money, and they're going to be carrying the guns and doing everything that they do.
But then are you open to arguments about market forces and how they're affected by drugs?
Could never be enforced. I mean, you know what? The state of New Jersey gets involved in boondoggles. We have Megan's Law because the person that killed Megan Kanka did 2 previous sexual assaults and didn't go to jail. So if you enforce the law, you're going to get the results. I just don't think that making marijuana legal is the answer. And people that get arrested for a small amount of marijuana, it's a disorderly persons offense. It's not a criminal offense. It's not the same as
But you lose the
indictment.
presumption of non-incarceration, and down the road it does make it more likely that on a subsequent offense you can wind up going to prison.
Well, except that
so it's another gateway phenomena.
No,
Yes.
except that if you get arrested for possession of a small amount of drugs, you get what we used to call in the old days the first offender program. You're put on probation, PTI, for a year. At the end of a year, whether it's my daughter or a black kid living in Newark, possession of marijuana.
But if you have no priors, that's true. So if
No
you're in
priors.
a community where people have prior convictions or prior arrests. So what I'm saying is that it can have an effect long term, even though it's just a disorderly person's
But
effect.
Ray,
on your history.
let's look at it from the standpoint. You brought up the death penalty. One of the issues that became clearer to me as we listened to so many people testifying, experts, aggrieved families, and so on, it occurred to me that the population expected some kind of outcome through the use of the death penalty that we were able to establish did not occur.
Deterrence.
Every now and then someone would say retribution, but mostly
nobody's
deterrence.
But there hasn't been a serious deterrence argument for years. Retribution at the core, which is a belief that you either have or don't have, is the issue, and you carefully steered around that because you don't change somebody's mind on a retribution. You either believe in it or you don't.
And we were able to establish, at least based on what people told us, it didn't prevent capital offenses. So let's apply that here. You see, the public thinks certain things will happen as a result of these stringent laws, never mind what's being proposed now, but that's not what we get. But as long as they believe it, the elected officials will play to the audience. I think science, and we had lots of good science at our conference, if the public could hear what is really at stake, and it's a lot different from what the political people will tell us, I think that number of people in support of this decriminalizing drugs would grow.
Hey, let me ask you, Doug, because as I listen to Bill, I wonder if both of you wouldn't agree that Don is correct when he says this is the tip of the iceberg, this is the attempt to open the door to legalizing not just personal use of small amounts of marijuana, but totally reforming, changing the way that we deal with drugs in this country. You think that's fair to say? And perhaps that's a good thing.
Some people, no doubt, think that, and they may be right, and we all have our own agendas. And so it seems to me every issue has to be looked at in its own merits, and we have to consider whether this is a good idea without thinking about the Pandora's box to which it might lead.
Bill, you would go a lot further.
No, I would agree that each issue should be considered on its merits.
But if the war on drugs doesn't work, are you saying call it off and let's make this a medical problem?
I think we've got to face that fact. We've got to face the fact that we've had for an extended period of time a lot of public resources, a lot of lives at risk.
But then why just marijuana? If the war on drugs is subject to criticism, and there is going to be a discussion about drugs, why are we stopping at marijuana and not looking at other scheduled drugs and saying, let's look at them pharmacologically, look at harm? Why isn't that done a rational process that involves looking across the board at what tools we use and what harm each drug might pose?
Well, I agree with that, but when we use the term war on drugs, we don't really have a war on drugs.
Let me tell you, we've got 30 seconds left, I'm sorry to say. So let me just ask you all very quickly. Will this legislation pass?
Never.
Don?
Never.
Not the first time around, but you've got to fail before you can succeed.
There's no way I can predict that, but I think the trend is definitely headed in that direction.
You hope so?
I expect so.
Okay, well, the debate is far from over, but I'm going to have to stop you there. My thanks to all of you. And I know this is a subject we will revisit once we see if decriminalizing pot lights up public attention and the political establishment.
But before we sign off, we want to encourage you to join us next week and every week, to like us at facebook.com/DueProcessTV and watch episodes you might have missed on youtube.com/DueProcessTV. For Sandy and all of us here at Due Process, thanks for watching.
I think nobody wants to be left with the stigma of, as a politician, of being soft on crime, but I think this is more of common sense.
It's legalizing it, that's what he's doing. And the issue, you have a couple issues here. One is, certainly it's a gateway drug.
Connecticut and New York realize that they just don't have the resources to prosecute these minor offenses involving small amounts of marijuana, and I think the state would be well advised to follow their lead.
And I can tell you this, what this bill will do is open a floodgate of profit to the black market. That's exactly what's going to happen. And it's not good for society any way you look at it.
End of the day, we give a lot of young people criminal records which are going to haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law, and by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy.